Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, blue liquor chills, desolate shirts, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot, welcome. And today I want to talk about Israel, and sort of in the context of Iran, because we have the final countdown to perhaps a nuclear agreement with Iran that's going on right now. And one of the backdrops for this discussion of Iran and its nukes, of course, should be Israel and its nukes. And I have to say I commend Obama and his efforts because recently he made two fairly bold moves and that have essentially, for the first time, internationally acknowledged that Israel has nukes. There's kind of this understanding that as long as we don't talk about it, we can pretend that it's not there. But, of course, that's the problem. Everyone knows it's there, and yet nobody's allowed to talk about it. But the two things that happened are, one was in 2014, Obama declassified government documents that showed that there was a 1969 meeting between then Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir and then U.S. President Richard Nixon. And they noted that there was a three-part refusal on the part of Israel which acknowledged their nuclear program. One, that Israel wouldn't sign the Non-proliferation treaty that was set up in the year before, 1968. And number two, they wouldn't agree to have any inspectors look at their nuclear program in Israel. And number three, they wouldn't accept an offer to give up their nuclear bombs in exchange for strategic ground-to-ground Jericho missiles that were capable of reaching all the Arab capitals. Apparently, Israel refused it because it didn't reach quite all of the Arab capitals. But fairly interesting that we have this history with Israel and its nuclear program where they won't even sign the Non-proliferation treaty, which Iran has, and Iran has honored all of its commitments and requirements for the Non-proliferation treaty, and that Israel hasn't allowed inspectors and hasn't had any inspectors in there for the better part of 40, 50 years. And yet we have Iran has had unprecedented coverage in their nuclear program from international inspectors. So, you know, just layers and layers of hypocrisy, and that's kind of what this is going to be all about. And then in just this March 25th, this last March 25th, due to a Freedom of Information request, the Department of Defense declassified a 1987 report that completely reveals Israel's nuclear program. So this is a big deal. Once again, we're getting public acknowledgement by the United States that Israel is in possession of a nuclear weapon arsenal. And this new one is very interesting because it's 386 pages, and it's called Critical Technological Assessment in Israel and NATO Nations. And it covers quite a few nations, but it talks about in the 1980s, Israel created bombs considered 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs that we'd seen previously. They were working on hydrogen bombs, and so their arsenal is relatively minute in quantity, but as far as quality and how much firepower they pack, fairly substantial. And apparently Israeli nuclear laboratories are the very equivalent to U.S. labs. So they are on the same level as the United States nuclear weapons program, and a lot of that is because of exchange of technology between the United States and its allies, and Israel having access to that as well as all the technology that they have gotten through espionage. And Israel apparently is at the same place as far as their nuclear arsenal as the U.S. was at the height of the Cold War between 1955 and 1960. So pretty startling that those documents have come out, and it's a good thing because the United States needs to acknowledge the existence of the Israeli weapons program if we ever want to be realistic about what we expect from other nations, and particularly in this situation with Iran, directly in this confrontation with Israel, or should I say Israel is in a confrontation with Iran. And in fact, as it turns out, back in 1968, the only way the United States could get a lot of the international participants to sign onto the Non-proliferation Treaty is if they didn't tell them that Israel had nukes and was not going to sign onto the agreement. Otherwise, probably nobody would have signed on to it. So let's get, since I'm bringing that up, let's get down to the history of the Israeli nuclear program in sort of a nutshell, so people can get a better grip on just what we're talking about this and why it is such a big issue and why it needs to be addressed, particularly now in the midst of this, like I say, these negotiations with Iran over their nuclear program. And let me remind you, we're still at a place where Iran has no nuclear weapons, and Israel has had anywhere between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads that they've had for the better part of, 70 years or so. So Israel never signed the 1968 Non-proliferation Treaty. And like I say, there's a debate about whether they have 80 warheads or 200 or 400. They have a nuclear arsenal that is the equal of what India has and what Pakistan has. So for a country the size of Rhode Island, once again, we have a huge arsenal, relatively speaking. Only a handful of nations, count on one hand, have more nuclear weapons. And a disgruntled technician actually revealed in 1986 that Israel had these nuclear weapons. So there is a precedent of some sort of public acknowledgement. But and interestingly enough, that same gentleman was pursued on charges of treason. And then actually last year, in light of the Obama release of information in December of 2014, just recently a former Knesset member, Abraham Berg, declared both nuclear and chemical weapons were in Israel's arsenal. So now we find out that as well, once again, we have all these countries in the Middle East that Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United States demand give up their chemical weapons, while Israel still commands a vast arsenal of those. And then we also have, if you go back through history, you find out that the participants helping Israel along were included the United States, although a lot of the technology from the United States obviously was gotten through espionage, but France, Germany, the UK, and Norway all supplied the technology along the way. And a lot of this espionage that's done is, well, as I've brought up in previous videos, a lot of times done by Jewish citizens living in America, or American Jews, or dual citizenship, Israeli Jews. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's hard to tell the difference. One has to look at the unforgettable story of Arnon Milchan, the billionaire Hollywood producer, who, of course, everyone knows produced Pretty Woman, and he was involved in espionage and was instrumental in helping Israel acquire nuclear warhead triggers, centrifuge blueprints, and uranium enrichment technology. And even Robert De Niro, who had talked to Arnon Milchan, Robert De Niro commented that Arnon Milchan told him that Israel is my country, and that's why he did it. He was recruited as far back as 1965 to help in these efforts. So let's see, Pretty Woman is, I assume, the 80s. And so for a good 20 years, he was involved in smuggling efforts with the Israelis and nuclear technology. And in fact, there was even a Israeli group called LACAM, the Science Liaison Bureau. So a real inoffensive and unexciting name for essentially their nuclear espionage spy team. And in fact, there's a very famous event of 1968 called the Plumbat Affair, where an entire freighter load of yellow cake, and this is in 1968, was commandeered and brought to Israel to build their bombs. And quite quite a spy caper when you read the details. I'll try to attach some information below on that. And as it turns out, these same documents that I referred to earlier that Obama released last year showed that Israel purchased about 100 tons of yellow cake from Argentina between 1963 and 1964. So pretty interesting. That's one of the other things that's interesting when you examine the history, is that almost as quickly as the state of Israel was born, they were envisioning a nuclear bomb, and were well on their way to achieving it within 5 or 10, 15 years after the state of Israel was born in 1948. So, and as we see, as early as 63 and 64, they were getting 100 tons of yellow cake from Argentina. And I don't need to remind anyone that 100 tons of yellow cake is a pretty substantial amount. When they talked about the yellow cake that supposedly was smuggled, being smuggled to Iraq, it was a minuscule amount comparatively, and of course it turned out to be a lie. And then we find out also that Israel helped develop South Africa's own bomb in the 1970s. So here we have this racist apartheid radical regime in South Africa during the 70s, and they were friends with Israel, and Israel helped them develop their bomb. And they did that in exchange for another 600 tons of yellow cake. So there's 700 tons of yellow cake going to Israel between 1963 and 1970. And as early as 1959, we have documentation of Israel was acquiring heavy water. So that's why I say within 10 years after the Declaration of Independence for Israel, 10 years later, they're already acquiring heavy water. And in fact, during that period in most of the 60s and 70s, France was the biggest supporter of Israel's nuclear weapons program. France decided in 1954 to build its own bomb, and then France gave the technology to Israel, Iraq, and Pakistan, even supplying engineers to Israel. And as a matter of fact, by 1960, this early on, by 1960, there were 2,500 French citizens, engineers, working at the Dimona nuclear plant in Israel, building nuclear bombs. And so that's everyone's got their hands in the cookie jar, as we see. But here, once again, I'm finding it interesting that France is not only supplying nuclear know-how to Israel, but also Iraq and Pakistan. So interesting little tidbits there. And you have to love that at this point in the 60s and 70s, the Israelis didn't admit to their weapons program. Well, they had already built bombs, and Israel finally revealed that they had built a nuclear reactor, much to the United States' chagrin. But of course, they said, quote, insisted it was entirely for peaceful purposes, unquote. It's interesting to hear that phrase come back to haunt us after everything that Israel is demanding of Iran, and how uncompromising, and all of these exchanges going on, and how can Israel be insulted when Iran says they insist that their entire program is for peaceful purposes, when Israeli used that same statement to lie for well over 20, 30, 40 years. And unlike Netanyahu's constant warnings of the last 30 years that Iran was weeks and months and a year away from the bomb, and never were, those whole times over these last same decades, and decades before that, Israel was in possession of a huge nuclear arsenal. So then we go, like I say, we move into the 1960s, and we find out that Israel refused the International Atomic Energy Association. So President Kennedy demanded they accept American inspectors. And this will also sound familiar in the context of what we're facing with Iran. Kennedy demanded they accept American inspectors, and Israel stalled, obstructed, and blocked. And this is their ally, the United States. And before each U.S. visit, fake walls were built to hide access to the lower levels where all the nuclear bombs were, and their nuclear weapons program was being built. So here we have Israel once again complaining that Iran can't be trusted and that they're stalling and obstructing and blocking, and that even if inspectors are there, they've hidden stuff away so we can't find it. And Israel should, I guess, has every right to be worried, because they have to assume that everybody in the world is going to be like them in the way they ran their nuclear weapons program, obstructing, blocking, and stalling, and then hiding their program, even from supposed allies. And by 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson was told Israel had acquired nuclear weapons. So 5 years after John F. Kennedy demanded inspections and was satisfied that apparently they only had a nuclear reactor for energy program, by 1968, of course, LBJ was confirmed to know that not only did they have nuclear weapons, but they were already practicing the technology for delivery. And once again, as early as 1968, that's only 20 years after the State of Israel was created. So I understand the idea of deterrence, but the fact that they were so adamant about building large nuclear arsenals so quick, and much more than is needed for defense, but not only that, making sure that they could deliver them as early as 1968. Not only that, 1968, let me remind you, is the same year as the Non-proliferation Treaty. So everyone else signed on, with Israel having a vast nuclear arsenal and not having to say anything about it, even though the United States, of course, at that time had confirmed it. So certainly the United States and Israel are in cahoots, hiding this program all these years. Although it's laughable, because of course everyone on the entire fucking planet knows that Israel has a vast nuclear arsenal. And I hate to break it to all the government officials out there, and the intelligence analysts, and even all the neocon base out there, but I got bad news for you. Everybody in the Middle East knows that Israel has a vast nuclear arsenal as well, and so that will always color their view of these demands that Israel and the West and Saudi Arabia and the U.S. Make on these requirements for these regimes in the Middle East. And then, as I mentioned earlier, of course, in 1969, there was a meeting between Nixon and Golda Meir, and they essentially agreed to keep the whole program quiet, and Israel could go on with it. But if they acknowledged it in public, then of course they would have had problems with the Non-proliferation Treaty. So then we move into 1976, and the CIA found out that weapons-grade uranium stolen by Israel from a processing plant in Pennsylvania had shown up in the Israeli program. And of course, as one would expect, there was an investigation that was shelved, and no charges were ever filed. But it was very clear there was repeated visits at this plant from a complete plethora of Israeli intelligence and nuclear experts, and the weapons-grade uranium was stolen. So this was in 1976. And that's one of the other things that's disturbing about this arrangement between the United States and Israel, is that this kind of espionage can go on with a few notable exceptions. A lot of these cases are swept under the rug, like the van load of explosives that was stopped in New York on 9/11 that was full of Israeli Mossad agents who were quickly released, and all of that is documented. And then, actually rather startlingly, during the Johnson-Nixon administration, concluded in talks with Israel that had been stated in a manner both explicit and implicit. And this is a very important point, I think. So the Johnson-Nixon administration concluded after these talks with Israel, and that the Israeli nuclear program was, quote, well, let's see what the exact quote was. Quote, Israel wants nuclear weapons for two reasons. First, to deter the Arabs from striking Israel, and second, if deterrence fails and Israel were about to be overrun, to destroy the Arabs in a nuclear Armageddon, unquote. So as early as 1968 and as early as 1965, we have Johnson and Nixon knowing that the Israelis want the bomb not only for a defensive weapon to deter, much the way the bomb is used by all countries on earth right now as a political tool and a military strategy tool rather than something to use. Although Israel's been one of the few exceptions since World War II. They have every will to use, and apparently almost used it in the 1973 war, but I don't want to go into that right now. Let's stick to this because the second part of that is very disturbing because it essentially says that a lot of legitimization for the occupation of Israel is the fact that might makes right, and they took the land and therefore they get to keep it, and then they justify all the occupied lands from conquering territory around them during these wars. But how interesting that if Israel were to lose, they would take everybody in the region down with them, and down to every last man, woman, and child. So I don't know about you. Well, I knew about you, but I don't know about them, how they feel about that sort of strategy. And of course, Nixon believed Israel's acquisition of nukes would spur a Middle East arms race if it were known. And of course, interestingly enough, Iraq, Syria, Israel, and Saudis all have their own nuclear programs anyway. And but it's kind of interesting to see this fear, this use of the fear of a Middle East arms race. We've had it brought up time and time again that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, there's going to be a Middle East arms race. There's already been a Middle East arms race, and I think all the countries in the region would have tried a lot harder to get nuclear weapons to be part of an arms race, since they've all known that Israel's had a nuclear arsenal for going on half a century. So this idea that somehow right now they're going to have a Middle East arms race, and they haven't for the last 50 years, is just illogical to me. And then we also have another startling fact about Israel, and that is in 1979, in their nuclear program. That is, in 1979, Israel conducted a nuclear test off the coast of South Africa, apparently testing 3 bombs. And this violated the test ban treaty that was enforced then. But of course, once again, Israel doesn't play by international rules. And Israeli sources even confirmed these 3 tests. So this is not speculation. And both President Carter and Reagan, once again, we have this collusion with the U.S. government to help Israel perpetrate this fraud. So they kept that quiet, and they kept the test ban treaty violation in these nuclear tests. And interestingly enough, too, in 2012, only 3 years ago, the U.S. was calling for a conference for a nuke-free Middle East, but they had to cancel it because they knew there would be a lot of pressure put on Israel to acknowledge their program. And I'm sure most of my viewers remember that because it was quite notable even at the time. And so there we have kind of a quick overview of how the Israeli program developed and why it's rather relevant to right now in these negotiations with Iran, because Israel has built this huge nuclear arsenal for years. They've had the will to use it. They've built the most deadly kind of bombs they could. They've built a hell of a lot more of them than they need to be a deterrent or even to defend themselves. There's a religious zealotry that they accused Iran of, and how reckless Iran would be with the bomb and all those religious zealots. But I see Israel as a country of religious zealots who would be in control of a bomb, and that scares me a lot more, particularly the fact that they have one and they have a lot of them. Iran has none. And even if they do, even if they've developed some secretly, it's still a moot point, because Israel is more than capable of defending itself, and anyone that thinks they are going to attack them, certainly to the level of delivering a bomb, would have a retribution that would be unimaginable. And so anyway, well, let's see what happens with these negotiations. I think it's going to be a better world for this, and I know there's many who disagree, although I don't know why. And I don't know why they don't want to bring the Israeli nuclear program into the discussion. And until they do, then it's going to be a tough argument to defend. And then, of course, we have associated with this program, we have these unfortunate events. A Israeli foreign leader basing his whole campaign on essentially continuing apartheid, denying a Palestinian state, and bombing Iran, and he got reelected. So he's got a mandate. That's what the Israeli people want too, kind of the way the United States works. And then we also have this unfortunate incident with all these GOP bootlickers and traitors in Congress. And fortunately, enough of them kind of woke up the next day with a bad hangover and realized what they'd done. But we have a lot of diehards in there receiving piles of AIPAC cash who are going to continue to toe this line and serve their masters well. And the nuts continue to come out. We have John Bolton did a recent editorial in the New York Times, and he said it was called, quote, "to stop Iran's bomb Iran," unquote. So John Bolton's one of the most heinous warmonger types, and he has no regrets for any atrocities that have been done in America's name, and he encourages more. He said that Bolton acknowledges that Israel has nuclear weapons outside international control. So that once again, that's interesting in itself. We have so many people willing to come out now and publicly acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons outside of international controls, and I pointed to several examples in this video, and yet we have nobody willing to publicly bring that to the table when discussing the situation with Iran. So what a childish, infantile world we live in, isn't it? So then you have Bolton going on to say, quote, "Ironically, perhaps Israel's nuclear weapons have not triggered an arms race. Other states in the region understand that Israel's nukes were intended as a deterrent, not as an offensive measure," unquote. So pretty interesting there that once again he acknowledges Israel's nuclear weapons and then says pretty much what I said, kind of surprising that it hadn't already triggered an arms race, which bolsters my argument that why anybody thinks there'd be a Middle East arms race if Iran got armed is beyond me. There's plenty of nuclear weapons facing Iran right now, should they ever make that choice. And then, but then for him to say that other states in the region understood that Israel's nukes were intended as a deterrent. There isn't one nation in that neighborhood that thinks that Israel's nukes are solely intended as a deterrent. And we're seeing that now because Israel's essentially threatening to use their nuclear weapons in a preemptive strike against Iran, a country that has not attacked Israel, a country that doesn't have a bomb. And and then of course he goes on to say, Bolton says, Iran is a different story. Of course, Iran is a different story because every story is different than the story of Israel, isn't it? Iran is a different story. Extensive progress in its nuclear programs reveals its ambitions. So for some reason, because of the progress that Iran has made in their nuclear program, its ambitions to have a bomb are readily apparent. Well, they're readily apparent to a bloodthirsty, hillbilly warmonger like John Bolton. But to any rational human being, it certainly doesn't make any sense. But considering what the Israelis have been doing for the better part of half a century, building their nuclear war program and their nuclear weapons program, it's clear that their progress certainly reveals their ambitions. And last but not least, I want to got a hat tip to Appa Google because he gave me a great idea in his presentation for this video, and that's to use the old Netanyahu chart. So as you can see, what we have here is we don't have to worry about 70 or 80% and what the first stage, what the second stage, and the final stage is, because Israel is already at 100%. They've been at 100% for, like I say, for 40, 50 years, and their fuse is already lit. They just have it timed, and they're going to use the bomb, and it's only a matter of time. So they already went ahead and lit the fuse. We're already past the final stage. We're in the final solution, 100%. So just in case anybody was unclear where we're at with Israel's program, I thought I'd use the Netanyahu method. So I'm sure it's all perfectly clear right now. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too?